This is John Basilone. He's a sergeant in the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanding 2 sections of heavy machine guns on a thin jungle defense line on Guadalcanal. And right now, he's staring into total darkness, listening to thousands of enemy soldiers singing and smoking cigarettes as they move toward his position. It's late October 1942. Basilone has been ordered to hold Henderson Field, a critical airstrip that controls the entire Allied position in the Solomon Islands. But instead of facing a standard probing attack, something the Marines had been dealing with for weeks, something else is coming. Something that will turn this night into a slaughter. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the elite Sendai division are charging directly into his line in wave after wave of frontal assaults, and they are met with a wall of machine gun fire so relentless that the guns are overheating. But then the machine guns run out of ammunition. One of his gun crews is completely wiped out. 2 men are dead and 3 are wounded. Japanese soldiers are breaching the line just yards away, forming up for another charge, and the only weapon Basilone has left is a Colt M1911 pistol and a machete. But then he draws the .45 and fights them off at arm's length in the dark. By dawn, 38 bodies are found around his position alone, many of them dropped by that single pistol. So why did this gun perform so well in the right hands, and what were some of its darker chapters of its story? That's what we're going to explain today, starting from the very beginning. In the years leading up to 1900, the standard American military sidearm was a .38 caliber Colt revolver. It was lighter than the old .45 revolvers from the frontier days, easier to fire and more accurate. On paper, it looked like a solid upgrade, but the men who carried it into the jungles of the Philippines would learn very quickly that it was anything but. After the Spanish-American War, the United States took control of the Philippines, and not everyone there was happy about trading one colonial master for another. In the southern islands of Mindanao and Jolo, the Moro people had been resisting foreign rule for over 400 years, first against the Spanish, and now against the Americans. The Moro were fierce warriors who fought with curved swords called barongs and bolos. Before battle, they would wrap their limbs tight with cord to slow blood loss, and they would use drugs to numb themselves against pain, and then they would charge straight at American positions. See, the problem was that hitting a Moro with a .38 did almost nothing. After-action reports sent back to Washington described Moro warriors with 5 or 6 .38 caliber rounds in his chest still running forward and hacking American soldiers to pieces before finally collapsing. So in short, the gun took way too long to kill an enemy charging your position. This brutal reality in the Philippines would end up creating one of the most legendary firearms in history. In desperation, the army dug out the old Colt 45 revolvers from the Indian Wars era, the same heavy single-action 6-shooters that had haunted the American frontier. They shipped them out to the Philippines, and suddenly the reports changed. The heavier .45 caliber round hit harder and killed anything in its way almost instantly, often stopping a charging warrior with one well-placed shot. So in 1904, the Army commissioned the Thompson-Lagarde tests, a series of experiments on corpses and live cattle to figure out which caliber bullet was best at putting a man down. Colonel John T. Thompson, the same man who would later invent the Thompson submachine gun, concluded that the new service pistol should fire nothing smaller than .45 caliber. That decision set the stage for a young firearms designer from Utah named John Moses Browning. Browning had already designed several successful pistol prototypes for Colt, and when the Army announced its competition for a new .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol, he went to work. In 1910, the Army ran the final torture test. Browning's prototype fired 6,000 rounds over 2 days without even a single malfunction. The gun actually got so hot during testing that Browning dunked it in a bucket of water to cool it down and then kept right on firing. The nearest competitor, Savage Arms, suffered 37 jams in the same test. On March 29, 1911, the United States Army officially adopted Browning's design, and with that they called it the M1911. It was a semi-automatic, magazine-fed, recoil-operated pistol chambered in .45 ACP and weighed about 2.5 pounds, held 7 rounds plus 1 in the chamber, and had a 5-inch barrel. The .45 ACP round it fired was a 230-grain bullet travelling at 850 feet per second, roughly twice the weight of a standard 9mm round, and it was built to stop a man in his tracks by any means necessary. So when the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the Army had about 75,000 M1911 pistols in its entire inventory for close to 80,000 enlisted men. That was barely enough to go around, and they were heading into a war that would demand tons of weapons. Colt and Remington went into full-scale production, and by the end of the war in 1918 they had turned out over 640,000 M1911 pistols. Springfield Armory added another 25,000 or so on top of that, but when it finally arrived at the front lines, the gun performed so well that it even shocked the Germans. You see, the Western Front was a nightmare for any weapon. Most weapons suffered due to the constant residue from artillery shells and trench bunkers, and longer rifles were nearly useless in close quarters. The German Luger looked elegant, and when it worked, its 9x19mm parabellum round devastated Allied troops. But it was too sensitive to mud and residue, and the British Webley revolver was reliable, but only held 6 rounds. rounds. The M1911 thrived despite those conditions. Its looser tolerances meant that grit and debris could get inside the action without jamming it. Its .45 caliber round hit so hard that at trench fighting distances of 5 to 10 yards, it could knock a man clean off his feet, and unlike a revolver, it could fire all 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger, and then you could swap in a fresh magazine in a few seconds. For American trench raiders slipping across no man's land at night armed with clubs, knives, and sharpened shovels, the M1911 became the preferred firearm. It was extremely compact, and yet powerful enough to end a fight instantly, and reliable enough that you could trust it would fire after crawling through 200 yards of shell craters and barbed wire. The M1911 quickly earned a reputation among American soldiers as a weapon you could absolutely bet your life on. Everyone from officers to trench raiders carried them, even machine gun crews kept them as their last line of defense, and compared to the German Luger, which was designed around the less powerful 9mm parabellum round, the Colt .45 delivered devastating force at close range. The .45 ACP bullet was designed to hit at a relatively low velocity, which meant it would dump all of its energy into the target rather than passing straight through. So now you know why the gun was considered so good. Let's talk about some of the darker stories from the soldiers who carried it, because some of them are genuinely hard to stomach. The most famous M1911 story from the First World War belongs to Corporal Alvin York of the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division. On October 8, 1918, during the Moussagon offensive, York and a small patrol of about 17 men were sent to take out a German machine gun position near the village of Châtel-Chéhéry in France, and when they stumbled into a group of German soldiers having breakfast, they immediately captured them. But before they could move the prisoners back to American lines, German machine guns opened up from a ridge above. 9 of the 17 Americans were killed or wounded in the opening burst, including the sergeant in charge. York, now the ranking man, told the surviving Americans to guard the prisoners while he went after the gun crews alone. He was about 30 yards from the German positions, armed with an M1917 Enfield rifle and a M1911 pistol. The German gunners had to raise their heads above the trench to aim at him, and every time one did, York picked him off with his rifle. A German officer saw what was happening and led 5 soldiers in a bayonet charge straight at York, figuring he was low on ammo and couldn't cycle the gun quickly enough. But they did not know about the .45 on his hip. York drew his M1911 and shot the charging Germans one by one, starting from the last man in line and working forward the same way he used to shoot wild turkeys back in Tennessee. After that, the remaining German officer surrendered, and as York marched his prisoners back to American lines, more Germans kept surrendering along the way. But then, the First World War ended while the M1911 story was only getting started. After the First World War, the Army made a few small adjustments to the design. They shortened the trigger, added an arched mainspring housing, extended the grip safety spur, and widened the front sight. These changes were mainly about making the pistol easier to handle for soldiers with smaller hands. Internally, nothing significant changed. The updated version was designated the M1911A1 in 1926, and parts were still completely interchangeable with the original 1911. When the Second World War broke out, demand for the pistol absolutely exploded. Colt could not keep up alone, so contracts went out to companies you would not expect. Remington Rand, a typewriter company. In total, the United States produced about 2.7 million M1911 and M1911A1 pistols across both wars, and these guns saw action everywhere, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Guadalcanal, where Barcelona used one to hold that thin line we talked about at the start. However, one story from the Pacific stands out as perhaps the most unbelievable thing anyone has ever done with a pistol. On March 31st, 1943, Second Lieutenant Owen Baggett was co-piloting a B-24 bomber over Burma when his squadron was jumped by 13 Japanese fighter planes. His bomber took massive hits to the fuel tanks and caught fire, so his crew bailed out, but the Japanese pilots started strafing them in their parachutes. 2 of Baggett's crewmates were killed in the air, and Baggett himself took a round to the arm. One of the Japanese fighters circled back toward Baggett, slowing almost to a stall. The pilot actually opened his cockpit cover to get a closer look at what he thought was a dead American hanging limp in his harness. However, Baggett was simply playing dead, and when the pilot leaned out to check on him, Baggett snapped up and fired 4 rounds into the open cockpit. The fighter stalled and spiraled toward the ground. The pilot was later found dead next to the wreckage with a .45 caliber bullet in his head. Owen Baggett spent the next 2.5 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. He weighed over 176 pounds when he was captured and barely 90 when he was freed. To this day, he is believed to be the only person in history to shoot down an enemy aircraft with a handgun. The M1911 went on to serve through Korea, where Brigadier General Sele Marshall wrote that soldiers praised the pistol more than in either World War, and it served through Vietnam, where it remained the standard sidearm well into the 1970s. But then something happened that most soldiers never saw coming. By the late 1970s, the M1911 A1 was showing its age. Most of the pistols in the Army's inventory had been manufactured during the Second World War and had been rebuilt multiple times. Congress started pushing the military to standardize with NATO allies, most of whom used 9mm pistols. The idea was that in a potential war against the Soviets in Europe, shared ammunition would simplify logistics across the entire alliance. So the military ran trials, and in 1985 they officially replaced the M1911 with the Italian-made Beretta M9 chambered in 9mm. The Beretta held 15 rounds compared to the Colt 7, had less recoil, and used the NATO standard cartridge. On paper it made sense, but the soldiers who actually carried pistols into combat were not happy about it at all. A 2006 survey found that the Beretta M9 had the lowest user satisfaction of any small arm in the entire American inventory. Over a quarter of the American troops reported their M9 had malfunctioned in combat, and here is what tells you everything you need to know about the M1911. After the Beretta replaced it for conventional forces, the units that actually used pistols to fight and kill, Delta Force, Marine Force Recon and Navy SEALs, kept using the 1911. Delta Force operators carried custom 45s into Somalia during the Black Hawk Down battle in 1993. Marine Recon units carried an updated variant called the M45A1 all the way through Iraq and Afghanistan. The Marines only fully retired the M1911 platform in 2023, over 112 years after its adoption. So when you look at the full arc of this weapon, from the jungles of the Philippines where American soldiers were getting hacked apart by primitive warriors, to the trenches of France, to the streets of Mogadishu and the mountains of Afghanistan, the M1911 was there for all of it. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.